our hope. Amen. Well, for those of you who are joining us online, welcome to hearing my voice. Apparently my mic was not on. Perhaps my head was elsewhere, but you did get to look at me.
They would have heard you through the hanging mic.
Heard me through the hanging mics, but not the excellence of my voice in the... You do realize this is a bit of a setup, right? That I'm pointing at me. It's a little bit of a setup. Just over a week ago, I got a call from somebody who's a freelance journalist in Edmonton who wanted to do a story for CBC Edmonton about inclusivity in rural churches. And they'd seen a video that Ben Wilson and I had been in, and they were just contacting people. Anyway, she wanted to talk to us about inclusivity in rural churches and where we were with our support of the LGBTQ2S+ community. And in fact, she ended up coming here to Bashaw and doing not just a sort of an in-person interview, but a video interview as well. And with me and Ben, I just want to make sure that you understand that Ben was here because he didn't make it into the story. Here's the thing. I really appreciate that happened, and I think it's great. It was great. You have to remember, of course, that journalists aren't really doing your story. They're doing their story about your story. And I'm trying really hard to remember that. And it was great, and it included a couple of folks from the LGBTQ2S+ community in Ponoka, and I thought it was a really good story. Here's my thing, though. It did catch me a little off guard that the very first sentence was, Reverend Robin King took over in Bashaw. And that phrase, that took over phrase, was used a couple of times. And the fact that the thing is, the whole story is about us, is the thing. You can't talk about inclusivity and then just talk about one person. And I do appreciate that she then went on to talk to a couple of people in the community in Ponoka, and she did talk to Ben. She did, Ben, remember? And it reminded me, though, and it is a good story. Thank you so much for doing it. Because it's great to have the message get out, isn't it? Which is just my point, is there's a fine line between take over and lead, isn't there? And the whole point of what we're trying to do with inclusivity is inclusivity of all. And one person can't do that. And see, I think, I will say, not only do I appreciate the story, I appreciate the fact that when you get past that first line, and I had trouble getting past that first line, but when you get past that first line, it does tell you a story about a very encouraging and hope-filled story about inclusivity. It does. And I may be the only person who got stuck on that because I'm super sensitive to it. But I'm super sensitive to it for a reason, aren't I? Which is that it isn't ever about one person. And the reason I'm mentioning this today, and this is kind of sticking with me today, is because we hear a story today in which I think whatever is written in the Gospel of Luke, you can't tell this story without acknowledging the fact that at some point Jesus must have said, this isn't about me. You guys go and share the story. That's what this is about. In fact, for me, I know last week we were talking about in the Gospel of Luke, there's this turning point, right? Where in Jesus' ministry, he's doing ministry, and then there's this turning point where he sets his face towards Jerusalem. And the thing is, there's also, I think, a turning point where Jesus goes, this isn't about me. In fact, I bet Jesus being here, he'd look at the Gospel of Luke and he'd look at the other Gospels, he'd look at the Bible, he'd look at all of the letters and stuff and he'd go, hey, this is good stuff, this is good material, this is great. Where's the book of the 72? Where is the book of the 72? In fact, quite literally, I know when I read that passage from Luke, I left out a chunk. It's a chunk where Jesus had a little rant about how bad people are. We didn't really need it, because the point is, there is no description of what happens with the 72. It simply says they returned in joy because they had such great success. Even the demons submit. They must have met a few people I know. Anyway, the point is, there's no description of how they went, what they did, or anything else. There's just this long thing from Jesus about, okay, when you go, like, don't take anything with you, go in pairs, but there's no description of what happened. I suspect that's super disappointing for Jesus, because that would have been super useful information for us. It would have been super useful information for us on two fronts, both related to, I think, what is the number one key issue of Jesus, relationships. He doesn't send people out by themselves, he sends them in pairs. So that's two people who have to work together. That's two people that have to get along well enough to go out and communicate a message of love and grace together. And there's the relationships that those two people are going to build when they go places. Isn't there? So there's the personal relationships and there's the sort of community building relationships. I think there's probably not a whole lot of difference there, but there is in terms perhaps of how people connect with each other and what they bring to creating personal relationships and community relationships. It would have been really useful to have that. I think that this is also the point, though, where we have to acknowledge that Jesus is trying to say, this isn't going to be just about me, right? So, this has to be about you. You have to do this. I am showing you you can. Please don't turn this into being just about me. Oh, we did. Yeah, we did, didn't we? How often do we? Even when we start to talk about how Jesus is the example, or Jesus is, we want to follow Jesus, all of the language that we use still puts Jesus somewhere other than here, which is where Jesus wants to be. I think that's what Paul means when he talks about sow in the Spirit. Right? You reap what you sow. It comes back to you, right? What you put out into the universe, whatever language you want to use around that, it goes out into the universe, it comes back to you. It should be good, shouldn't it? Because that's our factory setting. We should be living good into the world. We often struggle to do that, I think, sometimes. But again, how awesome would it have been if we'd had some stories about how the first people that knew Jesus and had lived with Jesus and followed with Jesus were able to, how they did that. I know what you're saying. We do have that. We got the book of Acts. We got the big guys, right? The big guns. What about the ordinary person? What about persons number 71 and 72? I'm particularly interested in persons 71 and 72 because there's a bit of a debate, isn't there, about whether or not there was 70 or 72. Right? Some versions say 70, some versions say 72. The latest, I'm not even going to try and do the letters, but the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, the most recent one, has now changed it back to 72. The New Revised Standard Version said 70. I feel bad for 71 and 72. I wonder how they feel about that. Seriously, though, how do we feel about that? Because it's not always the most obvious person. It's not always the person who's the most charismatic. In fact, it's not meant to be, is it? It's not meant to be the big grand gestures. It's not meant to be the big show of leadership. It's the everyday moments in our lives living like Jesus. Again, that's why it would have been great to have a book of the 72, because we would have had some sort of day-to-day how we do this from ordinary people trying to live what Jesus is teaching and showing us. It's not like we haven't had that, actually, over the last couple of thousand years. We have had really good examples of that. And we've taken those really good examples in many occasions and sort of gone, hey, super, let's put them up on the wall next to Jesus. Again, though, that isn't what we want, is it? What we want is for them to be held close in our lives so that we can live that ourselves. That we can take that spirit of grace and love into the world ourselves in our own unique and individual ways. Today, for some of us, our own unique and individual ways is that we are here. For some, our own unique and individual way is that we are directing people to park their cars at the Ponoka Stampede. Thank you so much for doing that. For others, that way is to be out in the world simply living and doing what we do, being who we are. And there again, there is a fine line, as Jesus reminds us constantly, between behavior and authenticity. Being authentically who you are and simply acting out. Acting out is easy. Living it is more challenging. It isn't always super easy to live like Jesus. Jesus is hard. Living like Jesus can be very demanding, particularly in a world that's as complicated as the one in which we live. And yet, here's a story, which, by the way, isn't only one of the Gospels. Here's a story of Jesus saying, no, it's you. Go and do it. Go and show people, tell them the story, take them two things. Take them peace and offer it. Take them peace and offer it. And those who will connect with you will connect with you. And those who don't jam it down their throat. Don't threaten them. Don't do the whole fire and brimstone thing. Walk away. Perhaps they might come back. Perhaps they might hear from someone else. There's always opportunity. But not if you bring them something other than peace. And bring them the good news. The kingdom of heaven is near. Even if they don't want to share your peace, remind them the kingdom of heaven is still near. I wonder, for those who accept and welcome and engage peace with those 72, especially numbers 71 and 72, who went out and heard the kingdom of heaven is near. Imagine how much hope that brings. Imagine too, how for those who connect with the message, it becomes not just a question of the kingdom of heaven is near, but perhaps it's here, and I can show it to others. I can make it be, even in my own little place, with my own little reach, just being an ordinary person, not being anybody, super important or popular or anything else, charismatic, any of those other things. Just my ordinariness, in my ordinariness, can be here. I think that's the message of this story for us. I think that's what Paul's talking about with the Spirit, sow in the Spirit. It isn't about the charismatic, cool, isn't that fascinating kind of person who's outgoing and well-spoken and does all of the right things and says all of the right things and can convince you. Because it doesn't take convincing either, by the way. It takes connection. It takes relationship. And that's what's going on here. It takes the connection with an authentic person sharing who they are, that goodness and grace, that image of God, and sharing that with others. And making relationships. We sometimes do that one-on-one. We sometimes do that in community when we gather. In both cases, you can't build relationships unless it allows for the fact that everyone brings who they authentically are. And that's always my thing about belonging, right? Is that belonging isn't just fitting in. Belonging is that what you bring actually impacts the community and becomes part of the community, it's creating that new thing, that community. It's not just a bunch of individuals, it's a community. Why? Because they all feel they belong. Because we've connected, we've built relationships. Something has happened that goes beyond just occupying the same space. We've created relationships. That doesn't mean pointing at Jesus. It means being Jesus.